Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast with Adam, Cameron, and Emily. Today's hosts are Adam Jones and Cameron Horine.
Welcome to another episode of the Made for Agriculture podcast. I am your host, Cameron Horine. The host you normally listen to that speaks the most, Adam Jones, is out today, so he won't be joining us, as well as Shannon McClintock is also off and won't be here today. But we've got Jesse, Kevin, and Scott on here again today. I think we've got a good bit to talk about. Crops are in the ground, starting to really take off, and so there's some things we want to definitely discuss, some hot topics that we've been seeing out of the field that we want to make sure we dive into and have a little bit more conversation of. Just to give you guys an idea of the time frame we're talking about today. Today is June 21st. So June 21st, 2024 is the date we're talking, to give you guys a frame of reference as we have this discussion today. First thing kind of wanted to touch on, there's basically everybody's wrapping up with first crop. Pretty much all the first crop has been planted in all the areas or being wrapped up today. Wheat harvest is really starting to take off in all of our trade territory, and double crop beans are going in. And I know right before we got on, Scott and we were talking about some of the wheat yields that we've been seeing. And Scott, you want to kind of touch on some of the wheat that you've been seeing that's been harvested?
Sure. It's good morning, guys. Just hearing, it's not across the board, but hearing some pretty incredible yields in a few places. A lot of yields on up in the 90s and beyond. Even the 1-teens and low 120s. Hearing a lot of that stuff, but I've talked to several firsthand. Guys I've worked with for years, and worked with them with yield monitoring and everything else, and just these are cross field averages in some cases. Pretty incredible numbers. Still trying to figure out everything that's going on there, but we've had I think conditions have been very favorable for nitrogen mineralization, carrying nitrogen over. I need to say, because I've had this conversation with a few of these guys, are like, we did this. Is this what's going on? Well, in a lot of cases, they did a lot of that stuff the last few years, and still topped out in the mid 80s. So obviously, we had some other conditions to push us on through that this year. But again, still trying to figure that out. But really feel like getting started early. We had wheat joining 20th of March versus second week of April. That made for some scary nights at the beginning, or scary early mornings, as frost came in and wheat that otherwise would have been protected was exposed to those low temps. But we got right up to the edge of that, but made it through. But that also meant that when we hit this heat of the last 10 days, 2 weeks, a lot of that wheat was already, already baked in as far as what we were looking at yield wise. So I think we were helpful on that end. We did have some heavy rains that could have had nitrogen loss, but we also had a crop growing there, as opposed to, we had the same situation with a little bit, small corn, or maybe corn not even planted. But I think just where we mineralized this in, held on to a lot of in, carried over a lot of in. The negative side of this is there was a lot of wheat that went down, particularly with some of the storms of the last few weeks. So we obviously pushed right to the edge, pushed right to the edge with nitrogen and on through it in some cases. But overall, though, as I'm talking to guys and getting the text and getting the yield monitor pictures and I'm quizzing them, hey, is that thing calibrated? Yes, I calibrated the grain card. I know what's in the bin. This is what it's making. And then they're just amazed. So again, not across the board. And wheat harvest is continuing still, but pretty neat hearing those numbers. And in a lot of cases, even with the heat and everything, soybeans are being planted right behind that in the moisture, and we're going to need a rain, but hopefully we'll at least get them up. So.
I will say the one thing I don't know that I've heard a lot about is head scab, and from that standpoint, I think we did fairly well manage that and having just quite honestly a low impact of that this year.
We were finding scab even after we treated fields, but as far as having issues that seemed to show up at the elevator. I think a lot of that was able to kind of blow through the combine. Now, we were talking a little bit before we started recording too, though. Talking about these yields, we're not necessarily seeing the high test weights that we, a lot of times we like to see. I don't have a full picture of that by any means. In a lot of cases, they're good enough, but just as I popped through stores and looked at tickets, at the scale, and I've also seen some fairly low ones and heard some low ones. So still trying to get a total picture of what's going on with the wheat harvest, but got some good yields out there.
Awesome. Well, that's good to hear. So we'll transition out of wheat and kind of have a conversation about some of the hot topic conversations that we've been having for the last few years, specifically when we think about fungicides that have been affecting corn. I know that Kevin, we've had some confirmed sightings of tar spot already in our trade territories. So Kevin, you want to kind of touch on, what we're finding from tar spot and kind of, what do we need to do or how we're going to manage that moving forward in the season?
You betcha. So this week through a Crop-Trak program, Megan Atkins is our consultant in District 3, so that'd be Northeast Missouri. She's found tar spot in both Schuyler County and Lewis County, and that has been confirmed by the university. When we find it, we try to send samples to the plant clinic, and we're able to actually send digital samples now, so we can get pictures sent to them pretty easy and get to try to help the plant clinic get everything mapped out. But anyways, so it's here, and that was on corn that was about V12. So for reference, you're looking at head high corn 7 feet tall, up to around 7 feet tall, depending on the variety, and probably about two weeks away from tasseling, maybe 3, depending on temperatures. But so, our recommendation is still going to be right at tassel VT-R1 when those silks start to come out. If we have tar spot early, I'm not in a huge rush to just jump the gun and go ahead and spray. The reason being, this goes for any disease. Just hybrid corn in general is very tolerant to diseases when it is in the vegetative stages. So we can have disease present, but that plant is pretty good at just defending itself and keeping it from spreading to new leaves and all that good stuff. But once that corn tassels and silk start coming out, it's put its energy into reproduction. So it's lowered its defenses. That's when we need to protect that. So when we have tar spot early, and I'll mention too, we've been finding a lot of gray leaf spot on corn too before tasseling this year. Same deal. But when we know we have those diseases in there, we shouldn't hesitate when that field's. We want to have everything ready to go once we have 90% of the tassels out in that field. We need to get that sprayed. Have that airplane ready to go, helicopter, whatever, drone, whatever we're using. But full tassel still our recommendation, even if we're finding it, a little early.
Awesome.
Kevin, did she happen to mention how far up in the canopy she was finding it?
Yeah, well, no, but she sent me pictures, and I could tell by the size of the leaf it was down low, which that means it was there. The spores were there in the field. Typically with tar spot, the first couple of years we were finding it, if the lesions were found up high, we could assume that was blown in. If you find the lesions down low, that means it probably would have came from that farm.
Okay, that sounds like a leading question, but I wasn't aware of that. So I'm glad I asked. Taylor found some the previous week over Taylor Nix that consults for us in Glasgow, Boonville area. Found some over in Howard County the previous week, and it was low in the canopy. But one of our interns found some this week in Ellsbury. She had hers confirmed. We haven't sent anything in from the Ellsbury one, but it's tar spot. And it's been a little bit of a hot spot over there. But that one was actually, it was already about waist high and pretty tall corn, which was a little bit of an outlier, it seemed like. But so
Yeah, I just double checked those photos on my phone that she sent me, and yeah, they appear to be leaves that would be in the bottom half of that canopy.
Yeah.
And then I got word last week that University of Illinois hadn't found it yet in Illinois, Central Illinois, but Kevin, you probably know more about it, but they were just tracking actual spores in the air, and they were finding tar spot spores in the air, just not on the crop yet.
Okay. Well,
Interesting.
Speaking of tracking spores, that kind of leads into what the next disease we're going to talk about when it comes to it, right? And that's southern rust. Jesse or Scott or any of you all, want to kind of talk about where southern rust is at and how that's going to potentially start to have an impact up for us.
So they're definitely tracking it in Mississippi and Louisiana. I hadn't heard much out of Southeast Arkansas, but Southeast Arkansas was several weeks behind any of us just because they stayed so wet. So I hadn't heard much, but the last 10 days we've had a lot of south wind and a couple due south storms that we don't normally get. So I'm going to say it's just a matter of time. We're more humid. We're back to kind of our normal summer where we're humid. We get storms coming through. So I'm just going to say it's a matter of time. The one upside to this is we had a lot of corn planted early. Granted, we had a lot of corn planted. It was either early or it's late. So my opinion is you still need to protect your yield. I mean, on this early corn, you can argue it either way, but a lot of guys like waiting until brown seal to make sure they get a little more protection on the backside, which makes sense. If you want to split that hair, split it. But now this later corn, it's still a couple weeks away from tasseling. When you start seeing tassels, we need to get that on there because the last thing you want is southern rust to just blow in because it's always one of them deals. We look, and then all of a sudden, one week we show up and it's everywhere. I don't know if we miss it or if it's just, I know it grows, it's very aggressive once it gets here, but it just seems like all of a sudden you're seeing it everywhere one week. So you sure don't want to get behind the 8 ball on that. And like Kevin says, once that plant hits reproductive stages, it doesn't protect itself as well. So we just want to be on the front side of that on this later corn.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say is, when you looked at the weather patterns that we've had here, especially really since this spring, we've had a lot of southerly winds in our area, probably more so than what we have. And we talked about it in episodes earlier when we were talking about wheat diseases that we were seeing early on, right? We were seeing stuff that we didn't normally see that was blowing us from the south. So that pattern's kind of kept up. And so it's a matter of time before we find southern rust at this point. So yeah, really, corn fungicide season's here. I know I talked to Shannon before he got on here, and that's one of the things he was going to mention in his area is basically all the corn is tasseling, or it's a week out from tasseling in his area, and so fungicide season's here from that standpoint. So make sure you're taking a look at your corn and have an opportunity of making sure you do try to protect your yields from that standpoint. What about soybeans? We've talked about, Jesse, we've been on some episodes where you talked about soybeans that went from R1 to R2 in your area and bounced back and forth there. Soybeans have started flowering. There's always been a discussion as to when you should go ahead and put fungicide on soybeans, if it should be R1, if it should be R2, if it should be R3. From that standpoint, where should we be thinking about putting out soybean fungicides today, or where do we sit there, guys?
I'm going to use the key term, it depends. And me and Scott were talking about it earlier, and I think it's different regionally just because of how these beans grow off depending on where you are. For me, let's just talk typical year. For me, I like that R3 time, maybe R3.5, if you're looking at them enough, because that can happen within a couple days. Uh, Scott likes R2, but his beans, like I'm able to get 18 inches of growth after R3, where Scott maybe won't get that much. Is that correct, Scott? You won't
Yeah,
get that much
when I
growth
say
once they.
when I say if we can somehow figure out that it's late R2, I still like R3. When it comes to fungicides, I'm always just preaching you got to cheat ahead of it, because if you pull the trigger right at a perfect timing, particularly a year when the beans do not flower until well after the solstice or right at, and we're seeing them hit R3, late July, say a late 3 beans hitting sometime, the third to last week of July, they're going to rapidly run from R3 to R4 to R5. And, I don't think any of us are wanting, for yield at least, wanting to target R4 to R5. I know they're labeled for that, but that's just not where we've seen the benefit. I mean, just working with them for 20 plus years, it's just not when we see it. We'll still see health benefits. You'll still see a bean that looks awesome. You'll still be cutting a bean most likely that's fairly green at harvest, but you're not going to see the yield. My concern normally, and last year was not normal, and this year is not normal, at least for all of the early planted beans, is that we've got to be on the front end of it because of just the things that you run into. I mean, all of a sudden you get a rain, you have a breakdown, you have a product issue. I mean, whatever it is, supply issue, and you delay it a week, which isn't a big deal, but sometimes, I mean, when they're fast, they can run from R3 to R5 in like 9 days. So that's where I'm getting at. I still, if you could pull the trigger right at the beginning of R3, that's where I'd be at. But if I'm starting to see a little bit of R3 in a field, and I've got a field beside it that I know is a similar or even same bean that was planted a couple days later, and seems like it's just right there but not quite, that's what I mean by late R2. It's not R2. It's R2 just right on the verge of R3 is what I would like to see. But again, this year, we're probably going to see some R3 beans in the next week, like we did last year. We had R3 beans. We were having this conversation. I went back and looked on the tail end of June, and in that now, they're going to camp out in those areas much longer, and we're not going to have near the rush. So it's a little different depending on when they start flowering and how long we spend in that area. So
We lost you a little bit there, Scott, but I think we kind of got the idea.
Yeah. But no, I know I kind of talked about general timings just because, well, after
I did
today,
that on the phone sometime. I just kept talking.
but after today, we get back to, we're going to start having shorter days. So I'm wondering if these beans aren't going to start acting more like a normal year when we plant them in that late April, 1st of May time frame. So, but for this year, like we'll just speak on it real quick. Like I had a lot of beans that were R3 for 20 days. And maybe even longer because they're still at R3 right now. And we decided that this week we got a dry spell here that we're just going to hit them and just keep an eye on them. But if you'd hit them at the first of R3 when you seen it, like we normally do, there's a good chance that we'd have to be spraying again on the backside because I'd mentioned earlier that we've got frog eye in central Arkansas. It's making its way too. We're just having one of them big disease years. But I think going forward, as long as you kind of get back to normal and keeping up, you'll be fine. But on these front ones, don't get too excited on pulling the trigger right away. We kind of got all over the place, Cameron. Did we kind of get to where you were wanting to go?
No, I think that's what soybeans, like we said, soybeans is a little different than corn, because of just how it matures, right? It's based on day length, really nighttime length, right? And so from that standpoint, and when we've had these earlier plantings, pushing on soybeans, that's kind of made a little bit difference. And so we've had to kind of recalibrate and rethink how we do soybeans to a certain degree, just because flowering has started earlier on that, but it's not necessarily pushing through those growth stages as fast, right? And so just kind of recalibrate our mind as, hey, when we first see R2, late R2 or R3, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to go ahead and pull the trigger on it because it may slow down, right? Whereas normally, what is real normal, but in the years past, when it's got to late R2, like Scott was saying, when it's got to R3, it's blown through those pretty quickly then at that point, right? And we've kind of seen a transition of that happening since we planted soybeans earlier. They drag out a little bit more. So, no, I think that was kind of the point I was thinking. And, I was also just, like Scott mentioned, when stuff gets to R3, especially now after the solstice, right? When stuff actually starts getting to that point, it will start to potentially blow through growth stages a little bit faster. And so if you're trying to schedule out fungicide applications, that is, like Scott mentioned, when you see something that's kind of starting to show R3, you may want to go ahead and schedule the field next to you as well. That's at your field, even if it's just still kind of mid R2, because by the time you may actually get a rig to it, it may be that perfect timing of R3, right? And so, because as fast as some of that stuff can blow through some of these stages sometimes, you may miss just because of limitations of application equipment, right? So yeah, no, I think that's, I think we touched on those. Is there anything else that, was pressing in your all's area that we may have missed or wanted to kind of catch up on?
No, sure.
Jesse, just for those people that like to hear about other crops, is there anything that's standing out from cotton, rice, or peanuts in your area?
Lots of fertilizer going out on the rice right now. Cotton's just, we finally got some 10 days of night. Burns, what are you cheesing about as I talk? But after some 10 days, 90 degrees, just everything's turned around. Cotton likes the hot, dry weather, and they kind of struggled early. It just seemed like they were spraying for insects every week because the cotton wasn't growing all fast enough to keep up, and it's looking a whole lot better. It's just been a good week for us after 6 weeks of rain on and off. Some good hot and dry weather.
Yeah. So cool. Well, I appreciate you guys jumping on. I was going to say, the last thing I was going to say is, looking at the 10-day forecast, at least as I sit here in Columbia, it looks like it's going to be hot and dry for the next probably 10 days, 14 days. We may catch that spot shower here or there just because the weather conditions are that way, but it sounds like we're kind of settled into what the summer is going to look like. I guess the one other thing I have heard of, just kind of point out from you guys' standpoints, we were kind of cool and slow from corn. We didn't capture a lot of GDUs with corn there early. With the way the weather's been, obviously corn really took off real fast. We caught a lot of GDUs. These last few storms that went through, I have heard of some green snap in some fields in some areas just because, the plants, they took off so fast with the high number of GDUs we were getting. So there is a little bit of stock strength from that standpoint, but it's kind of scattered based on where you got a storm. So those may be some of the things to kind of continue to look out for. If you do, we have spot storms with some high winds from that standpoint. Other than that, appreciate you guys jumping on. Appreciate everybody that gets on to listen each and every week. And we'll give you guys an update here in a couple weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Made for Agriculture podcast, brought to you by MFA, your whole farm solution.